Imagine an army so long that if you stood at its rear, you might not even see where it begins. Now imagine that this army isn't just a line of soldiers, but an entire city on the move. A city with smoking kitchens, tents being packed at dawn, medics treating wounds, engineers hauling tools, and even merchants selling bread and wine in the middle of the march. In this video, you'll step inside the moving machine that was a Roman legion on the march, hour by hour, step by step. And by the end, you may find yourself asking, could I even survive a single day walking beside the soldiers of Rome? Before we understand how a Roman march worked, we have to face the numbers. And they're staggering. During the High Empire, a typical campaign force could include 2 full legions, roughly 13,000 to 14,000 highly trained legionaries. But they weren't alone. Marching with them were 5,000 to 6,000 auxiliary troops, Numidian cavalry, Syrian archers, Germanic infantry, slingers from Hispania, soldiers who weren't Roman citizens, but who fought for Rome in exchange for pay and the promise of citizenship. Right there, we're talking about nearly 20,000 armed men. Now add those who made everything work behind the scenes: 3,000 to 4,000 cooks, slaves, servants, and military laborers. They cared for the mules, cooked, repaired weapons, set up tents, and hauled equipment. Many were part of the army itself. Others belonged to senior officers. And speaking of equipment, it's estimated that a marching army brought along between 4,500 and 5,000 mules, plus the horses of officers, cavalrymen, and messengers. Each animal could carry up to 130 kilograms of gear: wood, stakes, rations, siege tools, even disassembled catapults. Add it all together, and you have a force of 25,000 to 30,000 living beings on the move. Men, horses, mules, oxen, carts, and weapons. And that's not counting civilian merchants, local guides, or temporary messengers coming and going between villages and forts. The historian Polybius once described the legion's march as a moving wall of flesh, and he wasn't exaggerating. A legion in motion could stretch for 8 to 12 kilometers down the road, Vegetius warned. On the Roman march, formation mattered more than bravery in battle. The head of the column could be crossing a river while the rear was still tearing down tents from the previous night's camp. That kind of scale created a serious problem. How do you move a monster like that every single day without it collapsing under its own weight? That's what we'll see, starting with the next Roman morning. The March of Rome began when the world was still asleep, between 3 and 4 in the morning, during the 4th watch of the night. The first sound that broke the silence wasn't clashing swords or barking orders, but the muffled gallop of horses. They belonged to the speculatores, the legion's eyes and ears. More than scouts, they were an elite group trained to move ahead of the column, detect ambushes, monitor enemy movements, evaluate routes, and investigate suspicious villages. They departed before sunrise with a single objective: make sure nothing interrupted the advance of the Roman serpent. Meanwhile, back at camp, centurions woke their men with a brief blast of the cornu. Nothing was improvised. Each contubernium, a basic group of 8 legionaries, took down its leather tent, packed equipment, checked weapons, tightened armor belts, and inspected the condition of their sandals. Most importantly, every man carried his own world on his back. A Roman legion had no wagons for personal gear. Each soldier marched with 20 to 30 kilos of load: his gladius, shield, javelins, cooking tools, 3 days' worth of dry rations, stakes for fortification, and digging tools. They weren't just warriors, they were builders, carriers, and mobile laborers of war. At the same time, the High Command convened to review intelligence from the night before. The legatus legionis, military tribunes, and chief engineers went over reports from messengers and scouts, then selected the day's route. Marshes, rocky hills, or areas prone to ambush were avoided whenever possible. The priority: keep the march flowing and predictable, but never vulnerable. At that same hour, the animals began to be prepared. Mules were fed, carts inspected, and the impedimenta, the supply train, was organized with the same discipline as the troops. Any mistake there could bring the entire column to a halt. Just before sunrise, the head of the column was already moving. The sound was minimal. Discipline was absolute. The soldiers marched in silence. No talking out of turn, no laughing, no singing. The idea was simple. No one should know Rome was coming until it was too late. At the very front, where the unknown lay ahead and danger lurked around every bend, marched the vanguard. And this wasn't just a few scouts thrown together. It was a hybrid force, deliberately designed to be fast, reactive, and deadly. Rome understood that a surprise attack could wipe out an entire marching column if word didn't reach the corps in time. That's why the vanguard was made up of elite auxiliary units. Non-Roman, but hardened soldiers recruited from some of the fiercest peoples in the empire. Numidians and Thracians in light cavalry, masters of fast maneuvers across rough terrain, Gauls with hunting instincts, Cretans and Syrians armed with long-range bows. Protecting the core of that forward line were light infantry, lightly armed and barely burdened, ready to run, strike, or retreat in seconds. Their mission? Keep the road clear and secure before the main body arrived. And that meant facing tribal ambushes, disarming traps made of logs, hidden pits or buried spikes, inspecting silent villages that might hide hostility, and engaging in skirmishes with enemy scouts when needed. But the vanguard's job didn't end with combat. It was also the army's warning system. In regions like Germania, where thick forests limited visibility, the distance between the vanguard and the main body could stretch as far as 3 kilometers. That buffer zone was vital. It allowed forward units to send alerts, request reinforcements, or, if needed, retreat without throwing the entire column into chaos. Writings from authors like Vigilius and Tacitus highlight how crucial this structure was. Losing the vanguard in a long, stretched-out march often meant panic, disarray, and certain death for the legion. It was the first line of defense and the most fragile. That's why Rome didn't assign just anyone to that position. The men chosen for the vanguard were seasoned veterans, often hardened by decades of campaign. They had the authority to make quick decisions and knew they were the first to enter dangerous ground. If they failed, no one else would get the chance to respond. Right behind the vanguard marched the quietest yet most decisive men of the Roman march, the agrimensores, the military surveyors. Armed with simple instruments like the groma and korobits, they performed tasks that could determine the success or failure of an entire campaign. They were trained topographers, specialists in turning any terrain into a fortress. Even before the first tent was pitched, before the first shield hit the ground, these men had already mapped the exact coordinates of where the legion would sleep that night. Using stakes, ropes, and solar alignments, they defined the boundaries of the castrum, the fortified camp built at the end of each day. And they couldn't get it wrong. The chosen site had to meet near mathematical standards: a clean water source nearby, solid, well-drained ground, elevated position for visibility, access to wood and stone for reinforcement, and, if possible, an open field for deploying in battle if needed. And all of this had to be decided in marked hours before the first legionary arrived, because a legion stalled without a camp was a perfect target. Marching near the surveyors was the command nucleus. The legatus legionis, the legion's highest-ranking officer, didn't walk with the regular troops nor sit comfortably at the rear. He held a strategic position, isolated but accessible, surrounded by his personal guard, military tribunes, and a small team of administrative officers. From there, decisions were made: changes en route, responses to scout reports, last-minute adjustments for terrain, weather, or enemy movements. Orders flowed from the center like blood through veins. Horse messengers called cursores galloped from the commander's post to the front, flanks, or rear, carrying coded instructions. Everything had to be done with precision, without noise, without hesitation. Writers like Frontinus, in his Sardigamata, describe cases where the choice of campsite determined the outcome of entire campaigns. A poorly drained field could become a swamp after a night of rain. An overlooked hill could become a vantage point for enemy attack. A river too shallow might fail to protect the flank. And Rome knew it. What's most impressive about all this is that it wasn't exceptional. It was routine, repeated daily, as if every step of war had been pre-scripted from the very first movement. And then came the heart of it all, the central nerve, the beating soul of the legion, the main body. Here marched the veteran legionaries, the fresh recruits still in training, the stake carriers, the tool bearers, men who quite literally carried Rome on their backs. This core block consisted of about 13,000 legionaries, organized into 10 cohorts per legion, each subdivided into centuries of 80 men. Alongside them marched thousands more, military servants, slaves, and animal handlers, another 4,000 people, and thousands of mules, each carrying up to 130 kilograms of essential equipment. But what made this mass impressive wasn't just its size, it was the discipline with which it moved. The Roman march was organized with a precision that borders on modern military logistics. Each century knew its exact place in the column. Veteran soldiers were placed at the front to set the pace. New recruits marched in the middle, surrounded by experienced men to prevent disorder, and the troublemakers brought up the rear, where they could be closely watched. The march wasn't in battle formation. It was arranged as a narrow column, 2 or 3 men wide, adapted to the terrain. This allowed the army to snake through valleys, ancient paths, narrow trails, and mountainous regions without losing cohesion. Throughout the column, mounted messengers relayed orders. Trumpets and cornu blasts marked changes in pace, halts, or alerts. But none of it would have worked without one essential detail: weight. Each soldier carried between 20 and 30 kilos of gear, his armor, typically a lorica segmentata or chainmail, his scutum shield, gladius sword, pilum javelin, wooden stakes for fortifications, a shovel, cooking pot, water flask, spare clothing, dry rations, and even personal cooking utensils. The Romans nicknamed them muli Mariani, Marius's mules, a term born in the Republic when Consul Gaius Marius reformed the army and made personal gear transport a central doctrine. The daily march covered 20 to 30 kilometers, and that average was sacred, no more, no less. March too far, and the men were exhausted, vulnerable. March too little, and the campaign slowed, exposing the army to unnecessary risk. The pace was calculated, the effort distributed. The legion didn't rush, it advanced. And if someone collapsed, the rule was simple. If they were close and terrain allowed, they were helped. If not, they were left behind. Efficiency came before compassion. Behind the living wall of the main column followed the one element no general could overlook: the baggage train. It sustained the legion far from home, yet paradoxically, it was also its weakest point. Known to the Romans as the impedimenta, this long line of carts, animals, and servants wasn't an afterthought. It was the army's logistical heart. Here traveled the reserves of grain and salt, barrels of vinegar, construction tools, disassembled artillery, scrolls with maps and orders, spare tents, skins, cloaks, footwear, medicine, blankets. Everything needed to keep the legion operational for weeks without outside support. The train consisted of hundreds of mules and oxen, each carefully loaded with essentials. The carts, reinforced with thick wood, double wheels, and leather-bound axles, were guided by skilled servants. Some were enslaved, others hired. Many had served the same legion for years, knew the routine by heart, and in practice were treated as part of the military machine. Yet despite its importance, the baggage train was slow, painfully slow. That's why its placement was strategic, usually in the center of the column or directly behind the main body, shielded by the rear guard and flanked by mobile patrols. A single incident, a broken cart, an injured mule, a lost load, could jeopardize the entire march. Historian Josephus, writing about Titus's campaigns in Judea, noted that orders concerning the impedimenta were nearly as strict as combat rules. No cargo could be removed without permission, no cart left behind. Disorganization was punished harshly, sometimes even with immediate physical punishment. The train also carried essential personnel, medics with basic surgical kits, cooks with portable mills and kettles, campaign blacksmiths, scribes, and even interpreters. There were also backup animals, extra horses and mules in case of injury or death of key beasts. Protecting the train was so crucial that in hostile territories, entire detachments of light infantry and auxiliary cavalry were assigned solely to its defense. Because if the train fell, the legion couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't fight, and the world's most disciplined army would become just a starving crowd, waiting to be destroyed. If the vanguard was the eyes and the baggage train was the heart, then the rear guard was the invisible shield, the silent line that kept it all from falling apart from behind. In Roman doctrine, marching at the rear wasn't a punishment. It was a responsibility that demanded cold blood. The rear guard was composed of rotating units, auxiliary archers, light cavalry, and foot soldiers. These were seasoned men, accustomed to the pressure of constant vigilance and the knowledge that danger came from the shadows behind. They protected the baggage train, collected stragglers, watched the flanks in low visibility zones, and reacted quickly to any surprise attack from the rear. But the threat wasn't only tactical, it was psychological. A rear attack, even a small one, could spark panic. All it took was a rumor spreading among the servants and auxiliaries, a scream in the wrong place, a horn blast misinterpreted, and the entire column could collapse. That's why the rear guard had to be disciplined and constantly rotated. Its units were regularly swapped out to keep morale and focus sharp. It also served as a line of enforcement. Deserters trying to slip away at the tail of the column were caught right there and often executed on the spot, especially during critical campaigns. Discipline didn't end when a soldier left formation. It followed him to his last step, and history had taught Rome brutal lessons. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD was the most catastrophic example. 3 legions, led by Publius Quinctilius Varus, were annihilated by Germanic tribes through a series of lateral and rear attacks. The lack of coordination between vanguard and rear guard, combined with dense terrain and the stretched-out column, left no room for an organized response. It was the worst military disaster of the High Empire, and a logistical trauma that forever changed how the Roman rearguard operated. From that point on, rearguards became stronger, more proactive. They no longer just protected, they anticipated. In hostile territories, they were reinforced with their own lateral patrols, messengers, and engineers. But while the rear guards sealed the column, there was a group that didn't march at the front or the back. They moved along the edges, disappearing into the brush, climbing hills and appearing where no one expected them. They were the guardians of the flanks, the watchmen of the column sides. If the eyes of the legion were up front and the rear guard was the shield at its back, then the flanks were its constant vulnerability. The 2 exposed sides of a line that could stretch more than 10 kilometers. To protect them, Rome relied on mobile, adaptable, and discreet patrols, the flank guard. These men didn't stick to the main road. They moved in parallel, cutting through forests, scaling hills, scouting side trails, descending ravines and slipping into villages that lined the route. Their job was to observe without being seen, to detect danger before it became fatal, and when necessary, to strike fast and hard, neutralizing threats before they ever reached the core of the army. The flank guard was mostly composed of light auxiliary cavalry, Numidians, Thracians, Iberians, mounted on horses trained for rugged terrain. They were supported by light infantry with minimal gear, ready for ambushes and pursuits through dense woodland. In some regions like Germania or Dacia, Rome even recruited local scouts, native allies who knew the land better than anyone and understood exactly where an enemy was most likely to strike. Their routine demanded more physical endurance than any other unit in the legion. They marched farther, slept less, ate poorly, and still had to keep their eyes sharp and make snap decisions. They didn't just protect the column's sides, they protected its strategic integrity. Accounts from Caesar's campaigns in Gaul show how experienced flankers prevented ambushes in mountainous regions, where local tribes would lie in wait at sharp bends in the trail. In Britannia, it was common for entire detachments to be sent ahead, just to scout both sides of a valley before allowing the main column to proceed. A single failure by a flanker didn't just risk one life. It could open a breach kilometers wide. That's why the men chosen for this duty were almost always veterans, soldiers with initiative, terrain knowledge, and tactical autonomy. Because at the edges of the legion, there was no immediate command, no shouted orders, no trumpet sounding. There was only silence, trees, and the constant possibility of stumbling upon something or someone ready to kill. But none of this meant anything if, at the end of the day, the beast in motion couldn't stop safely. That required the most exhausting and repetitive operation of the entire march, building from scratch a fortified city before nightfall. As the legion approached the site previously marked by the agrimensors, it transformed into an automated military construction force. Every man knew his task. Every group had done it dozens, if not hundreds of times. Nothing was improvised. Nothing was left to chance. Even if the terrain was uneven, muddy, or rocky, the order was always the same. Fortify before you rest. First came the ditch, a defensive trench dug around the perimeter, usually 2 meters deep and about 3 wide. The removed earth was thrown inward, forming a mound that would soon hold the wooden stakes carried during the march. Those stakes, called volley, were part of every legionary's standard equipment. No campaign ever took place without them. Next, the 4 main gates of the camp were laid out. The Porta Praetoria, main gate, Porta Decumana, rear gate, and the 2 lateral gates, Sinistra and Dextra. Guards were immediately stationed at these points, even before the wall was finished. Inside the marked perimeter, the legion divided itself by quadrant. Tents were pitched according to a strict hierarchy. Officers in the center, regular troops on the flanks, auxiliaries in designated sectors, and baggage animals in clearly defined zones. At the center of camp rose the praetorium, the commander's tent, where a portable altar was also set up. There, sacrifices were offered, omens were read, and high command meetings held. The camp's internal streets followed a standard layout. Perpendicular lines wide enough for troops to move quickly and for strategic points to be clearly marked. Warehouses, kitchens, even latrines. Yes, even the latrines had a designated location. The most astonishing part? All of this was completed in under 4 hours. Writers like Vegetius and Josephus make it clear Rome's ability to turn any open field into a functional fortress was one of its greatest weapons. While enemies slept exposed to chance, the legion slept behind walls, armed, supplied, with escape routes and internal signals already prepared. And it wasn't optional, even if they were staying for just one night, even in seemingly safe territory. Fortification was part of the doctrine, part of the Legion's very identity. That level of organization, repeated night after night, is what allowed Rome to advance without relying on cities, fortresses, or allied shelters. The Legion carried everything it needed, even its own city. But when the final stake was driven, the last tent pitched, and the final watch assigned, a silence fell over the camp. And that's when the most tense part of the day began, the night. Unlike other ancient armies that saw nightfall as a time for rest or even revelry, Rome treated it as the beginning of a new operational phase. Because at night, the Legion didn't sleep. It watched. Each contubernium received its ration: raw grains, salt, vinegar, and portions of dried meat, if available. Soldiers gathered around small, discreet fires, keeping their flames low to avoid giving away the camp's location. They prepared their food. No banquets, just function. They ground wheat with portable mills and cooked a thick porridge called pulse. Sometimes they mixed vinegar and salt with water to create pasca, the sour drink typical of Roman soldiers. In parallel, medics treated the wounded, cleaning cuts, setting splints, and applying ointments made from honey and vinegar. It was also the time to care for the animals. Mules were brushed, fed, and watered. Any damage to carts, harnesses, or gear was fixed immediately because nothing could delay the next day's march. That night, the next day's orders were read aloud. Centurions received instructions directly from the tribunes, who had just come from the praetorium. Punishments were announced, warnings delivered, and when necessary, executions carried out, calmly as a clear reminder that discipline never slept. But what truly defined a Roman night was its silence. The Legion operated under a strict sound discipline code. No laughing, no music, no loud conversations. Even footsteps were muffled. The reason was simple. The enemy might be listening, and order had to prevail, even in the dark. Night patrols were strict. Each sentry was given the day's password, called the tessera, and had to present it at checkpoints during their shifts. Shifts rotated every 3 hours and were staggered to prevent exhaustion. The penalty for falling asleep on watch was the harshest of all: death by stoning, carried out by the sentinel's own contubernium. A brutal practice, but one that ensured no one forgot what was at stake. Even at rest, every soldier kept his shield within reach, his gladius at his side, his sandals ready to slip on in seconds. In case of attack, everyone knew exactly where to run, what gate to defend, what formation to take. The Legion was never caught off guard. It was the one doing the surprising. And so, after 24 hours, what seemed like just a military march revealed itself to be a flawless choreography of survival, strategy, and total domination of time and space. The Roman Legion wasn't just made of soldiers. It was made of planning, discipline, and a doctrine that could transform any hostile terrain into an extension of the empire. At once machine, beast, and city. It marched like a mechanism, breathed like a living body, and rose like a portable fortress every single day. And now that you've walked beside it for a day, ask yourself, could you survive this routine for even a week? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. And as always, may Mars guide you in battle.